All right, we're here live with Dr. Jesús Villa, and we're here to talk about ask him our questions about world building for the purpose of death, borders, and someone did ask whether we meant like borders between life and death. Certainly, that's a part of it, but also political borders is some of his work, as well as forensic anthropology and a couple of other things. In fact, let me just read you his bio. It's a little bit extensive because he's so awesome and does so many cool and interesting things. Originally from Las Cruces and La Villita, New Mexico. Dr. Jesus Villa is third-generation Chicano who has called the Phoenix Valley home since 2007, where he began his undergraduate studies at ASU, Arizona State University. He got his bachelor degree in anthropology in 2011 with a focus on forensics, a master's in religious study in 2016, and his master's was on the anthropology of religion, focusing on African roots of Mexican traditional medicine, magic, witchcraft, and healing. He received his doctorate from Arizona State School of Transborder Studies, and his research specialties are applied activist anthropology, thanatology, the study of death and dying in cross-cultural anthropological perspective. Specifically, he studies forensic work, culture, and how to maintain holistic health and wellness in a space of traumatic death, dying, and grief, which is probably super important. The structural and systematic causes of global migrant death and the crisis here in the Mexican-U.S. borderlands, and its connections to migrant and refugee death crises worldwide. He also studies necropolitics, necroviolence, necropartheid, the treating of death, dying, grief, and hunting as transborder social justice issues. He's a former medico-legal death investigator, forensic anthropology and ontology lab assistant, archaeological field monitor, and ASU student success support staff. Currently, he's a postdoctoral researcher for the ASU School of the Future and Innovation in Society, where he studies nature-based systems for wastewater treatment, reuse, and circular water economy, and socio-cultural implications of water reuse technologies and philosophies in the Anthropocene. He's also an adjunct professor of anthropology and archaeology at the Maricopa County Community College District, and an adjunct of political ecology and transborder studies for ASU, a certified death doula, and a curandero. So, lots of stuff on your resume. It was one of the things I noticed when I started following your work, was just how fluent all your stuff is, and yet, as an anthropologist myself, I know all this stuff is deeply connected, especially in a border zone. So will you kind of just walk us through a little bit about how you came to this research and what really interests you about this research?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all, for having me on and for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. And, I love public education and public science discourse and everything, so it's just a real pleasure and treat to be here. And I got my start pretty early on. When I was 15, I was in a high school government class, and there was a little bit of time before the bell rang one day, and so the teacher said, okay, well, you have 15, 20 minutes to yourselves, so do as thou wilt. And so I ended up pulling a book from the bookshelf in the classroom there, and I can't remember the title of it off the top of my head, but it was a book on forensic anthropology. And as I was flipping through, I was like, oh, this is it. I found the thing. Ever since I was a kid, I'd been hunting for fossils or arrowheads or potsherds or bones in the desert, and I grew up celebrating Los Días de los Muertos, or the Days of the Dead, with my family. Practicing this kind of folk Catholic tradition that was a mixture of indigenous Mexican Chichimeca traditions and liberation theology, Catholicism, and so culture and death and archaeology and these things were always on my mind. So I'm not sure, do I want to be an archaeologist? Do I want to be a marine biologist, paleontologist? And then I found this book. It's like, oh, this is the thing. It like ties all of my interests together, and I can work with the dead and elevate their voices and help them reclaim their faces and catch bad guys and solve crimes and stuff. And so it was kind of I had a laser-like focus. I was like, I'm going to be a forensic anthropologist, which at the time meant you had to get a PhD, sit for your board exam before the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. And then, once you get all that certification, then you can work for a medical examiner's office or coroner's office. And so I had my plan, right? And so, pursued that with kind of a laser-like focus through the rest of high school and through college.
So let me ask you a real quick question. Was this all like, I want to get as close as I can to being a real-world necromancer?
I can't pretend that like there was never like that element there, right? Because again, I grew up with these folk traditions of curanderismo, and ghostly visitations of family members, and I always loved stories of the supernatural or cryptids or the paranormal, all this kind of stuff. And so I think absolutely a part of my fascination with death and dying was also part of that kind of religious and spiritual element to it, and so I went to ASU and you managed to get an internship internship at ASU, kind of working and volunteering in the bone labs there. And I got to like glue together human skeletal remains from Gobero in Africa. So this ancient Paleolithic site. So like that's a pretty cool thing to get like as a freshman to be like working on bones that are I want to say like 80,000 years old or something like that.
That's really cool.
I might be I'm probably messing up the dates there. Sorry, Dr. Stojanowski, but
really old.
It was very, but really, really old, like partially fossilized, and so and I ended up getting an internship at the Maricopa County Office of the Medical Examiner in the Forensic Anthropology and Odontology lab, so helping with all the bone and teeth stuff. And that got me into my first big boy job out of college was the death investigator stuff. And and parallel to all that was my curanderismo journey, where like at 15, I started having these really powerful, vivid dreams that sometimes would come true in real life or would give me insights into things that seemed unexplainable. And I brought that to my...
For the audience, can you explain what curanderismo is?
Yeah, so curanderismo means the way of healing or the way of curing in Spanish, from the word curar, which means to cure or to heal. And it's the kind of blanket or umbrella term that we use as anthropologists and social scientists to describe this wide variety of traditional healing practices, traditional medicines, ritual and ceremonial practices that grew from the mixing of African, Asian, European, and indigenous healing and ritual practices during the colonial period in what we now call Latin America, right? And so my family is Mexican and Chicano. And so like my curanderismo and the stuff that I focus on is Mexican and Chicano. But it's, versions of curanderismo exist throughout the sacred and unceded indigenous lands that we now call the Western Hemisphere. And so it is that mixed, and so because it's that mixture of African, Asian, European, indigenous, Jewish, Muslim, all these other traditions that came together in that colonial period, it's a cousin to other Afro-Atlantic diaspora practices like Vodou and Hoodoo and Candomblé and Santeria, Lucumi, Espiritismo, all these kinds of traditions, right?
Yeah. Syncretic religions. Yeah,
which you might call syncretic. And so I brought these dreams to my abuelo, my grandfather, who was a a skilled healer in his own right, and a community organizer, and a mystic. He was an indigenous Catholic mystic. And so I brought this to him and said, well, Mijo, it sounds like you have the family gift. It always like tends to manifest with powerful dreams. And so you should consider following that curanderismo path. And he told me about how his parents, my great grandparents, were both curanderos. And, I began an informal apprenticeship with him where he taught me everything he could remember, but he was never like fully trained as a curandero. And so I learned as much as I could from him and from my cousin Vidente Brasas. And then one of my aunts told me that, if you want to call yourself a curandero and do this right, you need to find somebody who comes from one of those like unbroken lineages, and become their apprentice. And so the same year that I ended up like landing the forensic lab internship was the same year that I found my main mentor in curanderismo, Doña Patricia Federico Ruiz, and entered into a now 19-year teaching relationship. And after 13 years of formal apprenticeship, she and a council of elders from our healing tradition and from some others, recognized me in the ceremony as a full curandero and gave me permission to use that title, to accept those responsibilities, and to take on my own students. And so that was 2021. And so, yeah, I've been a full practicing curandero since 2021, walking the path since 2000, what would that be, 2004. And yeah, there was a very close parallel with the forensics, where like every major development in one also was a major development in the other. And then, yeah, to kind of like, to make a long story slightly longer, to answer your question, being in the medical examiner's office at 21, 22 years old, fresh out of college, I was not mentally, emotionally, or spiritually prepared for the realities of that work.
Oh, yeah.
With all the naivety of a, freshly minted 21-year-old college graduate, I thought I was, because I'd been interning there for 3-4 years at that point. And so when one of my partners on the job asked me like, hey, so what are you doing to take care of yourself? Because, most of us develop PTSD or similar disorders within 2 years of starting the job. I was like, well, I've been working in the lab for 3-4 years at this point. So like, I think I'm good. But there's a difference. Yeah, there's a difference between like spending a couple hours in the lab once a week to going to the scene and seeing the worst that human beings can do to each other and themselves for 40, 50, 60 hours a week, talking directly to, grieving family, seeing the actual aftermath, like all that stuff. And so, I did with it like right on schedule, within 2 years, I developed and received a PTSD diagnosis. I now know that I was also developing like vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, like all of the things that we now know from the literature, like is very common in these things. And
well, and I know too, there's a lot of, and this is really good for you world builders out there, if you're doing anything with medical professors, forensic scientists, if you're doing anything with EMTs, a lot of EMTs have incredible amounts of trauma. There's lots of testimonies of this stuff, and it's really something to consider as like when you're dealing with death in a society that A, does not have a healthy appreciation of death, and B, you're also dealing with some of the most monstrous sides of humanity, with murder and torture and all kinds of terrible things. Like it has to weigh on you. Like I have never seen very much firsthand. I did find a body of my landlord once who had overdosed, and was several days decayed. But that's not necessarily the kinds of things you're talking about. And so it's I did
was that and all of the above.
Yeah. So, those are kind of things to be thinking about the psychology of your characters. Like if they are dealing with these spaces of death, and even death and healing, like, a lot of healers, I mean, there's therapists need therapists, right? But it also includes, medicine practitioners across traditions. They need healing too, because they're also dealing with those kinds of challenges as well. So those are things to think about. Like, you see these people who go to a metaphysical bookstore and buy a bunch of books and call themselves a shaman. And it's like, well, reading and going and doing
Yeah.
that kind of actual work. And I did a little work with some indigenous medicine people in my life. Not enough to really know more than basics, but I was taught a few things enough to know that, like, these things take decades to become a master at, of hard practice and shared lineages and those kinds of things. And I think that's kind of really important. But
Big
that kind
time.
of leads me to my next question, and maybe I took some of yours. But what are your bones to pick about kind of misrepresentations of your work in media, whether that be book, film, shows, whatever?
Yeah, well, it kind of dovetails into like the tail end of like how did I get to where I am now? Is it, it directly like connects with the bones to pick. A great choice of word, by the
It was not on accident.
way. Yeah. So when I was at the medical examiner's office, I saw firsthand how the structural and systemic inequalities and injustices that we're more accustomed to talking about in the medical field or in law enforcement literally intersected at medical legal death investigation. It's literally the crossroads of those two massive systems. And so all of the implicit and explicit biases that exist in policing, in hospitals, in healthcare, uh, all of that stuff, right, were present in forensic work or in these spaces. But because we don't like talking about death as a society, and because all of this stuff is really upsetting and disturbing to a lot of folks, um, those systemic and structural inequalities, injustices, biases kind of never got talked about or acknowledged. They kind of flew under the radar. And, evil only grows when in silence, right? And so, or I shouldn't say evil necessarily, but harm only grows in silence, right?
Yeah.
And, that was honestly, that was the biggest part of my mental health and spiritual health struggles, was less the actual like traumatic death and suffering I was seeing, and more of the systemic and administrative side of things. The culture of the work, and how we were treated by county administrators, by some of the people in power in the office at the time.
Mm-hmm.
The inter-office politics, like that stuff ended up being the bigger stressors. And when I ended up like going back as a PhD student to do my dissertation, that turned out to be the case for all the people I interviewed too, which is kind of bonkers, like wild if you think about it. Is it's not seeing dead babies and suicides and plane crashes and horrific murders that is the main thing that harms people. That obviously like played a factor, right? But the number one thing that all of my respondents identified as being like the make or break factor for their mental health, for their holistic health and well-being, was work environment. It was either the thing that most supported their wellness or was most detrimental to it.
Well,
And
and
so
I
like that felt very validating, and
yeah, and I do remember, like, when I took a sociology of death and dying class in undergrad, which was just a fascinating peek into like how Americans treat death and commodify it and all this other stuff. But I think the most shocking fact was not that like a funeral costs more than a wedding. I kind of assumed that it was that bad. The most shocking fact to me was that a coroner is a political position. The person who signs the pieces of paper, who decides what a death means, is an elected official who does not necessarily, depending on what area you're talking about, need to have any credentials. Like in the state of Colorado, you don't need any medical credentials to be coroner.
Most jurisdictions that have a coroner system, you don't require anything more than like a high school diploma or GED, and ideally no criminal record. And obviously, like, there's more requirements depending on where you are, but yeah, it's an appointed position, and so you're not required to have any medical training or expertise, or even necessarily any legal training or expertise. And I do want to like honor one of my doctoral committee members, Dr. Gabriela Soto, in pointing out that having a system of dedicated professionals is better than having none. And so I don't want to just like unequivocally blanket just crap on all coroners across the U.S.
No, of course not. Some people are there for the right reasons, just like every profession.
Of course. And we do have to recognize that like that should be profoundly disturbing when, especially in, like, John Oliver did a great segment on coroners. I highly recommend y'all check it out. But he cites some examples where like, massive conflicts of interest would arise, where like the sheriff of a county was also the coroner. And so anytime there was, let's say, an officer involved shooting, it always turned out to be an accident, or
right.
The cause and manner of death is like nothing to do with shooting and nothing to do with person-on-person violence.
Yeah.
So
death is deeply political for a lot of reasons. I mean, speaking of which, I mean, you see Dolly Parton passed away today.
R.I.P. Heaven gained a hell of an angel, man.
Right. She was great example of a human being. But it's like the politics of how people discuss it online are just a whole interesting feel, right?
Yeah.
How they center the person, the family, or how they decenter the person, the family, how they make it about their political ideology, all kinds of interesting stuff.
Well, and even just like whose death deserves talking about.
Yes.
Whose deaths deserve
who's worthy
acknowledgement.
Right. Yeah. Worthy and unworthy victims, which is more of my area of specialty, which is media. So how do we decide who's a worthy and unworthy victim of various things? So, but let's oh yeah, for sure. Let's dive into some questions here. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in chat. I've got quite a list here from various spaces across the internet where I post stuff. So we're not short on questions, but I always prioritize the questions in the chat. So if you're here live, you get first dibs, essentially. I did want to mention there's a book that I really kind of think that any American who wants to understand how we perceive death should read. And it's called This Republic of Suffering. Have you read that one?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, another forensic anthropologist recommended that one to me, and a lot of her work was around death and archaeology specifically. But that's a book about how the concept of death changed during the American Civil War. And the whole concept of a good death and what does that mean, and our distance from death, because suddenly we had massive amount of people dying away from home, and more soldiers died from disease than they did bullets in that war. So it's a really interesting and fascinating read if you're curious about modern American perceptions of death. Maybe good research for if you're reading a Civil War book or you're writing a Civil War period piece as well.
I also wanted to just like quickly throw out some really brief bullet points to the bones to pick thing. Pretty basic ones, but like forensic people don't get guns, so don't write them. Forensics aren't really like Bones or CSI. There's kernels of truth there, but we don't get guns. We don't participate in like the actual criminal investigations. We're not on the scene when we're like looking for a murderer or whatever. And also, this is, I think, a huge thing for y'all world builders out there. I'm a fellow, I love writing speculative fiction. I love world building. So big pro tip, there's always a desire to like show forensics as like super technologically advanced and, like in bones, there's like this, 3D reconstruction machine that makes a perfect holographic reconstruction of a person's face and the entire death scene, and the thing is like one of the like consistently funniest things, maybe funny to us, maybe morbid to others, but like when civilians or police or whoever would come into the forensic anthropology lab, they would get really freaked out because we'd be macerating body parts. We'd be boiling down bones to remove the flesh from them so we could, do our examination stuff. And we'd be doing that in like crock pots that we got at Goodwill because they were $5, and like the measuring board that we used to do the estimation of stature, right, like plugging it into the algorithm for height estimation. The board that we used to measure it was literally just like somebody had nailed a piece of measuring tape to a 2x4 and we would like put a bone on there. And so like I made a nicer kind of like artistic one that was a little more precise, as a gift to the lab, but and when we're taking out fourth sternal rib ends or the pubic symphysis, these parts of the bones that we need to remove, we would use hedge clippers, or tree branch shears, which made a very graphic crunch that made people very unhappy, so it was like none of this like amazing rotary saw and stuff. Like the pathology teams, they had a lot higher end equipment because they could use it, and like we had Home Depot and Goodwill.
Yeah. I think John Oliver did a great episode on how forensic is not magic as well. Which I thought, I'm not a forensic anthropologist. I just have friends who are. I have friends who are morticians and forensic anthropologists, so the death space is not foreign to me, but I also, definitely consult, people like you for these kind of things.
Yeah, and just to make it 100% clear, like I am not yet a forensic anthropologist. I intend to pursue that certification and everything, but I don't want to misrepresent myself or anybody to get any, wrong ideas. I worked in a forensic anthropology lab. I was on that trajectory and then pivoted after leaving forensics and realizing like, okay, I need to work in forensics, but from a culture shift outside of it, as opposed to, direct practice inside of it. So went back to grad school to learn how power worked and to heal myself. So master's was more on the healing side, PhD was more on the power and systems side, and here I am. So,
well, speaking of power, our first question is actually, and this came from a direct message over, where was that from? I think Facebook. How do we write realistic border zones into fictional worlds? Which is not a simple question. We could do a whole episode just on that. But what are some bullet points of things to be thinking about in border zones?
Yeah, well, first of all, like very briefly, the question you had mentioned earlier, somebody had asked about, like, are you talking about regular geopolitical borders, or are we also talking about borders between life and death?
I think
or like more abstract ones. And I would say that that's, first of all, like that's a whole, like you said, a whole episode by itself. But the way that I use the term border is to refer to any line, real or imagined, that humans draw to create mutually exclusive categories of we, us here, and they, them, there. And that pun is also intentional, right? Because when you treat gender, for example, as a firm line that creates a binary of either male or female, either man or woman, which does not reflect biological or social reality, right? But when you treat it that way, it becomes a border because it creates these two mutually exclusive categories of this is what is a man, this is what is a woman. And if you transgress that line, you are treated with the exact same violence and rhetoric as a transgressor of a geopolitical border, an illegal immigrant or alien. Almost exactly the same rhetorics emerge, almost exactly the same violence emerges, the same kinds of legislation. We're seeing the real-time results of that right now. So I think the first thing to ask yourself is like, okay, what kind of border zone? What kind of border, first of all, and what kind of border zone? If we're just talking about geopolitical borders, then like you do need to ask like, okay, look at real world examples, right? Truth is always stranger than fiction. And so the best stories are going to come from real world stuff, right? So like in the EU, for example, internal borders are almost like the ones here in the United States, our internal borders between states, right?
Right.
They essentially are ceremonial, descriptive, like there's literal cafes that you can sit at where you order in Holland and you eat in France, right? Or Belgium, or, you like there are these great photos of like the border literally runs through a business or runs through and people just walk back and forth because the way that the EU has been set up, it is like basically one mega state, sort of. Each country obviously has its own bag and blah, blah, blah. But those borders have essentially become open borders.
Mm-hmm.
But the external border of the EU functions as exactly this kind of deadly, violent, necropolitical machine and institution that the US-Mexico border does, and which the US-Canada border does not as much. Like that is also a lethal border, but not nearly the same and not with nearly the level of scrutiny.
Yeah.
Right?
Maybe soon, though.
maybe, yeah.
The way things are going.
But yeah, this persistent fear of like the racialized other flooding us from the north has never really been a thing, right? And it is like there's no way to pretend otherwise. Like it is a racial thing,
yeah,
and it always has been. So when you're doing world building, and when you're trying to set up a realistic border zone, that's the main thing to ask. Is like, is this the kind of border zone that we see within the EU or within the US? Is it the kind that we see between the EU or the US and the countries it considers lesser, right? Or racialized others? Because that's going to look very different. That's going to be militarized.
Right.
That's going to be, but it's not just going to be government military, anymore. Everywhere is a melding of corporate, what I call unofficial necropower, and official necropower, that which comes from governments, right?
Right.
Necropower is the power to determine who may live, who must die, and who is considered worthy of death, dying, suffering, or deadly conditions, right? And everywhere that these necropolitical borders exist, there is an unholy union of private and governmental powers collaborating to do this harm. So I think that's a big thing. Is like surveillance is a huge thing. A lot of bioscanning, like those kinds of technologies for collecting biological data and like life story data. This kind of omnipresent surveillance culture. You have even more extreme examples are going to be like specifically, explicitly military borders or militarized borders, like the one between South Korea and North Korea, right? Where that's straight up a war zone.
Yeah.
So that's kind of taken to the extreme. Whereas like the US-Mexico border is also, I would argue, a war zone, but one that we just don't really acknowledge as such, because like the war is waged on brown and black bodies, and a lot of the fighting is left to the desert. The desert itself is weaponized to first of all, like the way that enforcement is done on the US-Mexico border, due to a policy called prevention through deterrence, it heavily beefs up militarization and enforcement at official points of entry, to discourage unauthorized border crossers from crossing there, and instead funnel them intentionally into the desert, and specifically into the hottest, most remote, most unforgiving, and deadliest corridors of the U.S.-Mexico border.
Yeah, and there's a book about that, right? The Land of Open Graves. If you guys want to know
Yeah.
more about that, it's the Anthropology book about this whole practice.
Yeah. Jason De Leon's book, Land of Open Graves, does a really good job of laying that out. There's also a book by my committee member and mentor, Dr. Gabriela Soto, called Border Afterlives, that I highly recommend as well, that talks about undocumented folks or unauthorized migrants who die crossing the border, the politics of haunting and memory, again, whose deaths matter,
Yeah. Border
and why,
Inc. Border
Yeah.
Inc. is another one, which is all about the militarization and the multi-billion-dollar corporations that go into policing the border. I don't know if that's exactly what this person was asking because they're not live stream. I think maybe, I mean, this is obviously important stuff too, but I think maybe what they're asking is, what does culture look like in a border zone? Like, how does culture blend when you have a variety of competing different cultural systems? But that maybe they were asking your question. We should cover both just in case, to make sure that, we got both sides of the world building stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's especially important to ask in like places where there isn't as much like hostility, where it's a relatively peaceful border. And, to be fair, like while there is an unimaginable amount of violence involved in the US-Mexico border, my family and I just went down to San Carlos, Sonora, and we drove down and crossed the border at Nogales. And Nogales is a town, like it's half in Arizona and half in the state of Sonora, Mexico. And it's gorgeous. And like people cross back and forth every day for work or, for shopping.
Yeah.
It's tougher now than it was before, obviously, but mostly it's just people living their lives. And, it looks like what it is. It looks like a contiguous town that is mostly Mexican, that had a artificial, arbitrary line drawn through it. It like the U.S. side, when you get right up on the border, looks just like the Mexican side, and vice versa. It's only like once you get into the country that you start seeing the differences and stuff. But I think that's another thing, is that like it's this weird dichotomy that I think is really rich for world building stuff, is that like it's both things are true at once, which is that, as with any other like oppressive power system, it's regular people just living their lives and doing their best to live a normal life. And occasionally there are these reminders, sometimes big and dramatic and often small and every day, that there is this order here, this power structure that, like, if you don't know your place in it, will touch you, in the worst ways possible. So, there's all kinds of border theorists, like Gloria Ansaldúa, her book, La Frontera, Borderlands La Frontera, is really great. It's a seminal piece of border writing. And, so she and folks kind of around that time kind of thought of border regions as this in-between place where it's neither quite like the US, neither quite Mexico. It's its own unique thing. And that's part of why normative populations on both sides look askance at it, or that kind of thing. Nowadays, I'd say that the kind of consensus is more that both sides do tend to more adhere to like their side of the border, in terms of culture and society, but that obviously there is this kind of exchange at all times, is kind of fluid back and forth. So it's not its own cultural zone, but at the same time, it's going to look different and feel different than other places.
Yeah, I think the classic article that I always assign, like, sophomore, junior anthropology students is the Gupta and Ferguson one, the Beyond Space and Culture one, just because it really does kind of ask this question about like what does culture mean to space and what does space mean to culture, and like can you really put a culture in a singular border? And like the answer is no. Like everything bleeds over into everything else, and this idea of that somehow there was this ancient past where we never interacted and we were isolated tribes is nonsense. And it's
Yeah.
and so it's just if you're building a border system, you'll want to be thinking about the like you said, and you'll see this because it's like that border does mark something in people's minds, and so they'll tend to be more allegiant to one side or other depending on where they're at a border. But like if you get a more porous border like you're talking about in the EU, or like like if I stand on the four corners, the famous four corners here in Colorado, where you have Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, which, by the way, the actual Four Corners is in the middle of a reservation, so you can't get there. So the one they have is a tourist trap. So you're not really standing in all four corners. That's several miles away in the middle of the Ute reservation. You cannot access it. But it is kind of like this thing, like what's the difference between the town of Cortez, Colorado and Farmington, New Mexico, which are just like 20, 30 miles apart in distance, but they're on different sides. Like those kind of borders are really hard to really parse and understand.
Yeah, and that's, I grew up with my grandparents in northern New Mexico, which is like the main area for manitos, or the like Hispanic New Mexicans, as they often like to call themselves, and where like it, it's southern Colorado and northern New Mexico are that culture area, and so like there's all these beefs, that you'll see sometimes about like, oh, Colorado has the best green chilies. Like, oh, screw you. Like, New Mexico holds the reigning, blah, blah,
Right.
blah. But like in that Manito cultural zone, like there is no real, you don't see any distinction between some of those like southern Colorado and northern New Mexico places, because like that was its own cultural like zone and area that had an arbitrary line drawn through it eventually. So,
and I also think it's important to understand that in a lot of ways cities are border zones. You have different areas of culture within cities, and then there's constant blending and changing all going on. And so cities are, I mean, if you want to really understand, like if you're writing a border, like maybe you have a port on a moon that's like a trade. The Star Trek Deep Space Nine is a great example, right? This space station is a border zone. It is, even though, well, and it becomes a literal border zone for the wormhole and stuff later. But like, it's literal a border zone just because it features so many different cultures and traditions, and because anyone can kind of go into that place, provided they're not in a state of war or something. Like, it really does create these kinds of really interesting blends of different zones, and you'll get things like syncretic religions like you got during the colonial period, with Curanderismo and Voodoo and all those various different traditions. So I think that's just something to be thinking about with border zones. Let's pull up another question here. Are there any universal or extremely common aspects about death in society that world builders should include and consider including in their work? This is from the Reddit user Swablu on a Cloud.
That's a great question. The thing about the social sciences is like the more that you study in these fields, the less confident you are in like making any universal claims.
So true.
Especially coming from like a religious studies background. That's kind of like the running joke in the field, is that it's an entire field that studies something that we still can't agree exists, or rather we can't agree on a definition of what religion is.
Nope.
But we have a whole field of studies on it, and so like I have my like go-to definition that I enjoy and that kind of stuff. But the whole problem with defining religion with a capital R is that like we're assuming that this is we're trying to make a universal declaration of like, okay, this is a definition that will cover all of this ridiculously diverse and complex uh, range of human expression pretty good, you know. And like there's always, but the thing is like there's always going to be like exceptions to whatever definition you use, right? So
For sure.
anyway, so like yeah, I don't know that there is a universal thing that you can say about death and dying except for that it's important to people.
Yeah.
And that it's important to people, and it shapes every aspect of our existence, whether we acknowledge it or realize it or not. Um,
Yeah,
and so,
I would also think that it would be good to think holistically about this, right? What does your culture think about death in the first place? And then what do they think about the body? And then how does that connect? How does death in the body connect with whatever practices that they think about these things? I would think like it's not a specific practice or a common aspect specifically, but looking at kind of like the relationship between life, how they feel about death, how they feel about the body, and if they have unique perceptions of the body, that is something you should consider as a part of the ritual, right? Or
yeah,
whatever their afterlife is, you're going to want to reflect that. But like, not all cultures even have an afterlife, so
yeah,
it's
exactly. Yeah, I think that's an important thing to remember is like, first of all, 100% agree that a big question to ask yourself about like when it comes to death is how does this culture, how does this group view the body? And the fancy, $5 academic word is ontology, right? So what makes a complete human being?
yeah,
In Western societies, it tends to be, which tend to be Christian or Christian influenced. There's this idea of like a physical body and a completely non-physical soul or spirit, right? Some people say that soul and spirit are interchangeable. Some people make a very distinct, difference between what it constitutes a spirit or anima versus a soul or alma. Um, but like not all cultures have that idea. Um,
yeah,
Mesoamerican traditions, like I like to talk about Nahua ontology or Aztec ontology, where rather than a soul or souls, they had what I've called like vital essences. They're these soul-like energies or ontological beings that first of all, there's three instead of just one. So you have three souls instead of one big one. And they do have physical locations in the body. They're core, like there's the breath of life, the ihio, which is attached to your liver, and like the diaphragm. So you see that moving. You have the teolia, or the movement of life, which is the heartbeat. And then you have the tonali in the head, which is the spark of life, the heat and warmth of living things, and tied to reason and rationality and that kind of stuff. So intellection, and then like teolia is like your personality, your individual self. And that's the one that lives on after death. And ihio is like your power that you can express into the world through words and song, right? And to be considered a fully living and complete human being, you have to have a physical body that houses those three vital essences, right? So very different concept to the soul, and like the relationship of like what that is to the body. It does have profound implications for afterlife ideas. So yeah, the body stuff is really important. Determining like what your culture's orientation is to what we would call the supernatural, right? So that's another issue with some definitions of religion, is that they'll say like, belief in supernatural beings or a supernatural power.
good old E.B.
But
Tyler.
but yeah, E.B. Tyler, J.G. Fraser, and these guys, but like there are plenty of examples of like you don't need any supernatural stuff to have a religion. Like Buddhism famously, like, even though there are, you know, branches of Buddhism that involve spirits and demons and you know, otherworldly beings, none of that's like required or like core features of Buddhism. There's no even like concept necessarily of divinity, just this idea that like by following this path, you can release yourself from a constant cycle of suffering, right?
Right.
So you don't need gods for that, or supernatural power.
Well,
so
and some traditions of Buddhism actually think gods get in the way too. So it's like, you know,
exactly.
like, so good, like, because you're not supposed to rely on anything outside yourself. So relying on a deity, even praying, is an anathema to some schools of Buddhism. There are some schools of Buddhism that have blended with Christianity, and you have like Pure Land Buddhism, which is a messianic form of Buddhism that Amitabha has come to liberate you, kind of thing. So there's lots of, and that's another thing to think about when you're talking about these traditions with dealing with death and dying and afterlife and all that stuff, is like, if you're in a culture and the culture has thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, there will need to be variation in all of these things.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that like there's, in every culture, no matter how big or small, there's always going to be variations in how people interpret it and how people interact with it and live in it, right? So treating your culture as a monolith, for like, ah, yes, all of these people think this way or act this way or believe this, is going to take away from the believability. Or you can use that as a really great like foil for like, ah, this is how the moon colonists are describing the local population that turns out happens to be there, right? But in reality, like, their culture is just as complex and weird and beautiful and messed up and triumphant as ours, right? But yeah, that idea of supernatural, right, being outside of the natural order, and like that's that division between natural and like material and empirical versus supernatural, completely immaterial, unempirical. That's a very Western construct, this idea that there is a strict border or definition between what is natural and what is not. So like the definition of religion that I like to use involves this idea that you know, a religion is a system of you know, worldviews and beliefs involving a superhuman order, right? So it doesn't have to be outside of the natural order, but it is considered to be above and beyond a human's ability to control, right? And so like part of why I love that definition is that it allows for a framework in which we can critically evaluate things like, well, any ism, right? As to whether that ism is acting as a religious tradition, right? And so that's a hill I will die on, is that like, when we examine, for example, capitalism,
it's
through that lens, then yeah, it functions in function and structure. It fulfills all of the requirements for an academic definition of religion. And capital, the capital F, capital M free market is the superhuman order, right?
Right.
That, you know, even like the way that like Adam Smith talks about like the invisible hand of the market, you know, and the way that like, but more importantly, the way that regular people have internalized that to the point where it creates this view of the world that is clothed in such an aura of factuality that it seems common sense or natural, right? And so this idea that the market gives and the market takes away, the market moves as it will, the market self-corrects, it punishes unorthodoxy like socialism and communism, and it rewards orthodoxy, good capitalists. Its priestly class even wears white collars and even operates in temples modeled directly off of Greco-Roman temples. They have their own rituals and ceremonies involving bells. They have their own symbols and totemic heraldic imagery of bears and bulls and eagles and eyed pyramids. And
just imagine what an archaeologist would say excavating that from in 3,000 years, right? excavating the stock exchange. What is this? What is
And
all this strange ritual material?
yeah, and I think very importantly, like it requires human sacrifice, and two
Yeah,
specifically that false idols that whose power can only be demonstrated through constant human sacrifice
right.
to
It's
justify the
also
power.
and it's also why people treat words like communism or socialism as sinful in a lot of ways
Yeah,
because
because they
it's
violate that orthodoxy. Exactly,
exactly,
their
yeah.
heresy.
So um another question, same person, are there any cultures that have particularly interesting ways of dealing with transformation?
Oh, I mean, I'm biased as a, as an anthropologist, but I think all cultures' ideas of transformation are fascinating. It's kind of a cop out, but when you actually like, it's like when you say a word often enough in a row that it starts sounding foreign to you.
Yeah,
When you actually start, looking at even, the concept of transformation and how we deal with it in our own culture, things that seem normal and boring or everyday to us, when you start trying to like understand it from an outsider perspective as best you can, you start saying like, oh man, that is, I never thought of it that way, but we do some weird stuff about
yeah.
transformation. Uh,
Any favorite stories or
but yeah, favorite
examples?
stories. Yeah, I mean, like I love shapeshifter narratives, and how different cultures regard tricksters, as like, you know a lot of more kind of European traditions tend to view trickster, or like shapeshifters as ambivalent at best, but usually as like kind of evil figures or
Yeah,
dangerous figures. Whereas like in a lot of indigenous cultures, tricksters are always dangerous because they're always powerful, but they're not good or evil. They're just tricksters. Their job is to disrupt and cause you know um, conflict that results in change, right? And so Coyote is as often a creator figure as he is a destroyer figure, and he's as often a like figure of great reverence and respect as he is a complete fool and clown and just ridiculous nonsense person. And like same thing with Anansi or Iktomi or any of these figures. So yeah, I love me a good shapeshifter narrative, uh, especially like around like regular humans who achieve the ability. So like berserkers in Scandinavian or Germanic tradition, or the Ulfhednar, those who turn into wolves instead of bears. Versus like the Nahual of Nahua tradition, somebody usually like a medicine person who can transform themselves into their animal guide, for lack of a better word, a spirit animal, right? And so often it's a jaguar, but um, all human beings are born with multiple animals that are considered their patrons, guides, guardians, spiritual expression of their self, and you can, learn the ways to transform into that. But like that figure is very different from like the skinwalker Natloshi of Dene or Navajo tradition, which is a very unambiguously evil, harm-doing, just the
yeah,
worst thing that a human, basically the worst thing that a human being can become. And same thing with like the Wendigo up north.
right. Wendigos are,
We're not in
yeah.
the winter, so so it's okay to kind of briefly mention these guys, but we won't spend too much time on them out of respect for the Anishinaabe and other folks. So
Yeah. Um, you know, the book that we actually read for Resistance Reads actually back at the beginning of the year that I really kind of point people to thinking about tying transformation to story and like critiques of power is I don't know if you've read it, but Stephen Graham Jones' Buffalo Hunter book. Um,
I,
it is so good. it's their kind of approach to vampires is that you are what you eat. So if you eat white men, you start becoming a white man. If you eat a bunch
Oh,
of beavers, you become a beaver. And it's very much a critique on colonialism, of course. But it is an incredible book. I can't recommend it. If you love horror, and you're really looking for something, a fresh, very fresh take on vampires, it's a great piece, and it's really all about transformation, and like what does it do to us when we have to become a consumer of terrible things, right? So
yeah,
that's kind of the key. So
yeah. No, that's, no, you mean you had me at their concept of vampire. Like, okay, cool. Speculative fiction, horror, and fresh takes on
yeah.
favorite stories. You got, I'm sold. Yeah.
And he does some interesting things with the narrative as well, like story within a story kind of thing. That's just really,
Yeah.
it's a little confusing at first, but you get a hang of it really quick, and so it's really good. Um,
Yeah. I think, yeah. And also on the transformation note, I think a fun thing, especially for story writing and world building, is, what kind of transformation are we talking about? And how does this culture or this person or this group view transformation? Is it like a one-time thing? Is it a cyclical thing? Can you go back and forth? Is it
yeah,
permanent?
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Those are
are
all
we talking
very, very different kinds of stories too, and
physical transformation as
right.
opposed to like emotional or spiritual transformations, cultural transformation? So like, yeah, there's a lot of rich territory to dig into there.
Yeah,
So
and as always, reading widely across different cultures and traditions is really helpful for kind of playing with these various ideas too, because I think one of the reasons I do shows like the show, and we wrote our world building book, Build Better Worlds, was because we just kept seeing the same speculative tropes recycled over and over and over again, and we're like, if you know a little anthropology, you can kind of play with some ideas in different ways and
mhm.
reconsider your story world. So yeah, just all these things to think about with transformation, and I think that's a really key takeaway too, is the whole, what does the transformation look like? Is it optional? Is it forced? Can you go back and forth or not? Is it a one-way trip? What does that transformation look like? And
Yeah.
the going back and forth is really interesting and rich too, if they can control it, because what in life, what transformation in life do we have really much choice about that we can go back and forth? I mean, we're not the same person from day to day.
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah,
that's kind of
like
an
I think,
interesting.
yeah, no, especially like thinking about sci-fi and I suppose horror to an extent too. Like when you're talking about, let's say, alien beings who don't necessarily have um, a physical body the way that we do, right? So if you have a species who doesn't have like a set form, what does transformation mean to beings that don't have a like standard human body or a standard body that looks more or less the same every day, right?
Yeah.
So if they are inherent, like if they are these, a let's say, like a sentient cloud kind of being, or a liquid being, right? A living liquid being. What does transformation mean to somebody that inherently is formless?
Yeah. Odo and Star
Um,
Trek, you
yeah,
know, their kind of default state is a puddle, right? And then everything else is just constant playing with shapes and forms. And
yeah.
you know, one more question we've got, or call for one final question after this one. So this is a longer question. So some forms of transformation, like death, are considered important and impactful, even if it happens frequently, like in times of famine and war. Other forms, like healing and minor ailments or performing an everyday folk spell, are perhaps less notable. What can world builders do to be more deliberate and show the different levels of importance and various forms of transformation that happen in their setting?
Yeah, I mean, may not be like a super insightful answer, but I think you can demonstrate the weight and importance of these different levels just by talking about the ways in which regular people encounter them and meet them. Because yeah, like pretty universally, like any human is going to react differently to death as a transform, and specifically like the biological death of a human being differently than that of, say, an animal, and differently than like a social death, like, you know, cutting somebody off out of your life, you know, or what thanatologist Cole Imperi calls shadow loss, which are losses in life, not losses of life.
Ooh.
But
Ooh, I
but they
like
are
that.
losses that, yeah, and they are losses that are no less grievable or impactful, but they don't have the same social standing or response. So a divorce, for example, is the death of a marriage, death of a relationship, but and people are going to view that as an impactful and important change, transformation, but it's not going to carry the same weight as somebody dying, right? The death of a dog is going to be given a lot less cultural and emotional weight by most people, even though, like, when my dog dies, I'm going to be a complete mess because, like, she's my family. But there isn't that societal, like, built-in sympathy on the same level as, like, oh, my wife died, you know?
Right.
Because people people will straight up fix their face to talk to you and say, well, you can, don't worry, like, you can get another dog. But they will never necessarily, you know, you're not really going to see too many people come and say, oh, don't worry, you can get another wife.
And people do. Some people too just get a dog
Yeah,
immediately. They're just like, man, I'll just
yeah.
get a new one. You know.
And you know,
So.
if that's their healing, you know, approach and their grieving approach, then power to you, right? But yeah, you know, loss of a job, like that can be, you know, a massive and very grievable thing, especially like if you have built so much of your identity and all this stuff on that job, then losing it means that, like, you didn't just lose employment, you also lost a sense of self and an understanding of who you are and what your relationship to the world and other people is, right? And honestly, I went through a lot of that with the forensics thing, and you know, being like having to leave and realizing, oh man, that plan that I had since high school is no longer exists.
Yeah.
What do I do now? You know?
Yeah. We grieve.
So,
We
yeah,
grieve a
shadow
lot
loss.
more. We grieve a lot more than we realize on a lot of stuff. I mean, if your favorite coffee
Yeah,
shop goes out of business, you grieve. Like it's like all
yeah,
kinds of stuff, right?
yeah. Your
'Cause-
favorite show gets canceled. You know,
right.
shout out
Right.
Gallivant,
Like or Stargate,
Pushing
the whole
Daisies, yeah,
yeah.
Stargate.
But I think another thing to think about in terms of showing different levels of importance to consider would be level of community involvement, right? If
Yeah,
you're just doing a
yeah,
minor healing on somebody, then, you know, okay, but maybe one or two people or a couple of people will be involved. But if you're talking about like a spell of like saving somebody's life from near death, it requires 10 people in the village to use their magic powers, or like a ritual of binding or something that requires, you know, binding a magical creature into a tree or something. I recently was rereading Running with a Demon with my son, and there's this magical tree where they bind the creature inside, but it's you know, in the past, and it gets out, and that's the story, part of the story of the book. But you know, if you're needing something that's going to impact more people, then that's going to be showing levels of importance as well. It's like how big of how big of weight does it have on the community?
yeah, yeah. What's that human response, that community response? Um, yeah, all of that, and yeah, there's like another point that came to mind, but it seems to have flown the coop. But it'll come back if it's important. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's all we kind of have time for. We have a couple of more questions, but I think just trying to unpack them would be another hour's worth of discussion for sure. So thank you for all the great questions you submitted from all over social media. I got a ton this time. So last couple things is oh, here we got one final question that just popped up on YouTube. We'll do. How do we historically understand the way communities respond to plague? Is the grief the same, or does fear overpower it? Ooh, that's a good question.
Oof, that's a great question. Because yeah, I mean, I know it's a kind of a maybe an unsatisfying answer, but it depends. There's a lot of different ways that people have encountered and thought of plague, or of massive disease outbreaks and that kind of stuff. And so yeah, honestly, I think what I would recommend when you're like writing something like a culture's response to a massive pandemic or something is look at a few different real world examples, and especially like if you have an idea of like what your culture looks like and what real world cultures it most resembles, just dig into some of those historical accounts, and try and get as many different sides of it as possible, because like how indigenous folks describe uh, and conceptualize what was happening to them during colonialism, the epidemics that came because of it. Like those narratives align in some ways, in some surprising ways sometimes, with those of the colonizers, and obviously they diverge significantly from them too.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, fear is always present. It's always going to be in times of mass death and suffering. Hope is always present. Resilience is always present. Reactionary, I think that's another thing, is like what some folks are going to be reactive to tragedy versus like some are going to be proactive about preparing for it beforehand. Or even if they weren't necessarily prepared for it beforehand, like meeting the challenge more pragmatically as opposed to just kind of knee-jerk reactionary stuff. And so like that's going to look different, and I think provides a lot of rich material for like building, tension and conflict in a story between different factions of, who responds to the Black Death, on like a really deep theological level versus like this is a class opportunity level, versus like it's both, or all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah, and I did some consulting work for a company who were trying to figure out how do cultures respond to pandemics. So I actually like did a little diving into this kind of stuff specifically for them. And I noticed, so I looked at the Black Death and cultural shifts and a lot of things that happened. And then I also looked at the 1918 pandemic to think about how to conceptualize grief and loss and mourning and all this stuff in those, and what kind of changed in the culture as a result. And, first, like economics always completely reshape after a pandemic. They're never the same again. And we're kind of seeing like this with like the rise of tariffs. Even if we would have had a particular president in that situation, the economics would have changed regardless. Not they'd be different than the tariff situation, but they would have changed, or we're already changing with inflation and all that other stuff. But one thing I noted that during these reactions, in a lot of ways, people trade their grief for desperately trying to find meaning. And so they mythologize. And when I say mythologize, that's what the anti-vax, QAnon, all that stuff, conspiracies, like that stuff was all there before. But like, and this happens pretty much with all the pandemics. We had like these, like in the Black Death, there was like these roving killer cults that would go around slaughtering villages for having a Jewish person. Like all kinds, or a Muslim person, or anyone who was non-Christian, or a witch, or whatever they would be the accusation. Someone who fit out of the normal, appropriate, and social order before the pandemic would suddenly be, for lack of a better word, demonized, which is a little punny there. But
sometimes literally,
sometimes literally, and accused of being a demon, or various other things. And so a lot of mythology kind of gets wrapped up with that grief, because your entire way of living and knowing the world has been completely uprooted. And so both the 1918 pandemic and the and the COVID-19 had, and we don't know as much about, the Black Death because there's not as much writing around, but conspiracy theories abound all over the place. People are, and conspiracy theory are a kind of mythologizing. They're a way of like making meaning out of complex information that you're struggling to understand. Or that making meaning out of things that don't fit your cultural narrative, even if there is an explanation for them. So that's like a lot of things that happen in the midst of massive tragedy, specifically, I think, with illness, with plagues. I think a lot more people are prone to conspiracy theory because even with germ theory, even with all the science we do have, there's still a lot of chance involved in who you saw at the grocery store that day, or that feels kind of supernatural. And so I think it lends itself very well to kind of magical thinking in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think an important thing to remember when writing and when world building, and whether it's about people's responses to plagues, to death, to shadow loss, to these changes, these big changes that mark transitions, right? Regardless of like the challenge that the person or the culture is being faced with, humans, as a general rule, we need meaning. You know, arguably almost as much as we need like air and water and food. We are
our brains are pattern making machines. That's what they're for.
Exactly. We're profoundly social creatures whose evolutionary success depended on assigning meaning to patterns, right? And so like we always need a why. Why did this happen? And so like having an explanatory framework isn't always sufficient, right? So there are absolutely obviously people who like for whom a scientific explanation of just a pure cause and effect, like why did this happen? Well, because this bat bit this person, coughed on this person, now we have blah blah blah, right? But for most people there needs to be a that's a how did this happen, not a why did this happen, right? Why implies a deeper meaning, a deeper narrative, deeper significance. And so even if there is a like endlessly validated explanation that does explain how this happened, right? People will actively ignore or downplay or attack that explanation if it doesn't satisfy that need for meaning.
Yeah,
and
why?
Especially if it conflicts with those deeply held pre-existing concepts. And like I think one thing I really encourage all creators to think about is that like all of us do that. Dunning-Kruger is not just for those people, it's for literally all of us.
Everybody. Yeah, we all do it sometimes. So,
like, the more educated you are, like frankly, the more susceptible you tend to be to Dunning-Kruger. Because like we're on the opposite ends of the bell curve, right? The less you know, the more confident you are about it, and the more you know, the more confident you know about more about everything.
Yeah.
And so like even folks who pride ourselves as like very scientific minded or rational or these things, like we are always emotional beings before we are rational ones. Our rationality and our intellection and our reason, our logic is always rooted in deep emotion. And back to Trek, the Vulcans, right? They were deeply emotional beings who had to temper it with overcorrecting to logic, right?
Right.
And so yeah, no matter what challenges or disruptions are faced, humans are gonna humans and arguably other species are going to look for meaning. And I think that's the fascinating thing, is like seeing what meanings people assign and why, and the chain of events that follows. I think the Black Death is a great example, because a big part of why so-called like Western society doesn't like talking about death, why we are so death anxious, why we are so death averse, is because of the Black Death. And like part of why it had these profound effects on like world culture and in general, but also Western culture in ways that like the 1918 pandemic didn't, is, you know, scope and number of people and all these explanatory frameworks and stuff. But, you know, it was world ending, you know,
Yeah.
a third of a third to a half of the population, depending on where you are, just disappears,
Yeah.
and a quarter of the world's population, it has no, you know, this the idea that we are all equal in death, that, you know, you can't take it with you, that, you know, the king is just as dead as the peasant, that didn't exist before the Black Death, really. This idea that we are all equal in death, or that death is the great leveler, the great equalizer, you know, we are all the same in death's eyes, like, you know, that was absolutely not an idea beforehand, right? We have pyramids built for certain dead people, and, you know, bare holes for others. You know, there was no pretense that there was a lack of hierarchy in death or the afterlife. It's not until this world-ending event where everybody died, regardless of social class,
Yeah.
religion, gender, origin, right? Whatever. All of a sudden, death has taken everybody equally, and that has profound implications for, like, oh, well, then if we're all equal in death's eyes, then, like, what does that mean for religion? Are we all equal in life? Why does that lordling decide he's better than me, when, like, now I'm one of a much smaller working class and I have a lot more bargaining power, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yep. Labor
and
unions got a
also,
huge
like,
boost.
and like all of your royal family got wiped out just the same as my peasant family. So, like, maybe you're not better than me. Maybe
Yeah.
as we move into this early modern period, we should start challenging existing power structures and collective bargaining. And so, yeah, like, just the profound transformations that the Black Death had on every culture that it touched, but especially, you know, a lot of these European cultures, in ways that we are still, like, reckoning with, and, like, the deep level of ancestral trauma that get, you know, epigenetically encoded in these populations of survivors. Like, we're still just kind of starting to reckon with or realize how so much of this colonial nightmare comes from unaddressed trauma from the big dying, you know. And so,
Yeah.
anyways, that's the kind of, like, deep rabbit hole, fun world building stuff
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
love to soak
Um,
in.
yeah. And if you guys are really interested in like a very well written book that's like a time travel book, Connie Willis is actually is a Colorado local. I've met her a couple of times down at Cosign Con in Colorado Springs. She wrote a book called The Doomsday Book. And the Doomsday Book is like about historians who are time travelers who go back to eras, and oops, they miscalculated this time, and she was supposed to go back before the Black Death, but ends up smack in the middle of it. Um, and it's it's a hell of a read. It's a hard read in some cases because I mean the amount of trauma that she goes through, experiencing first. Now she's got all the modern inoculations, and also she has special inoculations to make sure she doesn't give disease to other people. So they've kind of thought of that, so she doesn't get sick, and she's not afraid of being sick. But like people are dying all
Other
around
stuff
her.
to worry about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, you know, it's an interesting narrative trick to kind of like allow the reader to really experience the horrors of the Black Death and what that was like.
Yeah.
And
Michael Crichton's timeline, I think, is really good for that too. Like, he has
yes,
a very, you know, I won't spoil it, but don't bother with the movie. The movie's never as good, right?
terrible. The
The book
movie was
I loved.
terrible. The book was
It
great.
was That was awful, yeah. But book I loved, and I won't spoil his approach to it, but he has a really cool, like, quantum physics take, on, like, historical paradoxes and stuff that I thought was pretty fun.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
highly
really good.
recommend. Yeah,
Um,
especially if you want to do, like, yeah, more time travel stuff, and there is some plague stuff in there, and some good things about, again, just like some of the profound differences in just how we view the world and the things that we take for granted, now versus how people viewed the world and took things for granted then.
yeah,
So, yeah,
yeah,
good
and
stuff.
I think this is a constant critique I have in time travel books in general, is the assumption that people thought the way that we did now. Like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
people, like, there was like an article in, oh, the Atlantic. Don't get me started on that, but it keeps popping up on my feed. Maybe because I like leave comments that are like irritated all the time. I don't know, but like it popped up and it was like people in the past didn't have the same emotions as us. And it's like, duh. Of course they didn't. They didn't have the same cultural and environmental conditions we have. Of course their
Or
emotions were different. Like that's
or
just
like I would argue that like the emotions were the same, but again, the explanatory frameworks and the way that we deal with and view emotions were completely different. And that it might be like sound like a semantic difference, but like I think it's a very important one because like, you know, reading the Bible, for example, like you see all of the complexity of human emotion that we feel today, and why so many people still connect with that text, right? Is because like you can easily see very relatable human emotions and situations and all this other stuff, right? But one of the really frustrating things about a lot of people's interpretations of these texts is that they are bringing a purely 21st century interpretation of what
right.
anger means, what sorrow means, what loss means, what sexuality, gender, political structures, all these things, right? And they're assuming that like because I can see those emotions that I identify with, that they are also interpreting them the same way as I am,
Yeah.
and they aren't. You know, I think that's a big thing that you can do as a world builder, as a writer, is to look at the effect that language has on cognition, and how like yeah, having different verb tenses, having different forms of conjugation, these things, like the way that we speak literally forms the way that we think and relate to the world. One of my favorite examples is, I can't remember the name of the exact group, but there was an anthropologist who did some work among some Aboriginal Australian folks. And this one group, like famously, didn't have a word for left or right. They always orient themselves to the cardinal directions. So, like, watch out, there's a snake to the north of you. Or, yeah, could you grab me the pot, the third one to the east, you know, that kind of thing. So, everything is always in cardinal directions. And what this anthropologist started noticing was like, oh, because of that orientation to the world, they can never really get lost. They always have an innate sense of where the directions are, and therefore how to find it and how to move. Um, so they're always oriented in place, and so like they orientation is their relationship to the rest of the world as opposed to the rest of the world relationship to you. It's to my left, your right, you know. So the individualistic orientation. So like he tested this by I don't know how ethical this is, but he like blindfolded a guy or a few guys and drove them way out into Whoop Whoop in the middle of nowhere in the desert, right, to a place that they'd never been before, with landmarks that like no landmarks that they would have recognized, right? And took the blindfolds off and said, okay, how do we get back? And they pointed the tire tracks and said that way. No, but he asked them like, okay, so where's north? And immediately, like they just like very briefly looked around, like, oh, it's right over there. Pulls out a compass and like, oh yeah, that's perfect north, and
Yeah.
and so like, yeah, because of their language, because of that lack of individualistic orientation to the world, and instead this kind of universal oriented in the four quadrants kind of thing, their literal relationship to the rest of the world and their ability to navigate it is completely different from the rest of us, right?
Yeah.
And things like in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, the Nahuatl people's language, there aren't pronouns for just about anything. And so, like, you have gendered language like Lord and Lady, Tecuhtli versus Siwat. But if you're saying like my brother or my sister, you use the same term like Ikni. And so you'd say So yeah, it's like sibling, and it's all contextual, right? And you don't say like, oh, that's her pen necessarily. That's like, oh, that's my sibling's pen, you know? So that possessive gendered thing isn't there. And also, uh, it's always, you don't like have a standalone word necessarily for that relationship. It's always specified whose sister.
Hmm.
So like Nansin is the root word for mother, for example, right? But you never say that is a mother, that is a Nansin. You always say whose mother it is. To Nansin, our mother. Mo Nansin, your mother. No Nansin, my mother, right? And what that does is that it means that all of your language conditions you to view your world as a web of relationships that you are inherently and always involved in,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
there's no way to separate yourself from social relationships with other people, with the natural world, with the with time, with the elements. It is a kinship like level relationship, and we just don't have that in English. You can just say a mother, a father. I am a mother. I am a father. Not
And
I am
yeah,
their mother, their
English
father.
English is very very focused on nouns. Very focused on nouns. In fact, I was just rereading the great book Braiding Sweetgrass. I read some of it in grad school, and I never read it all the way
Love,
through.
love
But
Kimmerer.
yeah, yeah, but you know, there was that passage when she was talking about trying to learn Potawatomi, and she was like, 70% of the language is verbs. How does that work? I don't understand why. And then, you know, she kind of goes through this whole reflection about what could that mean. And then she's, oh, because everything is in relationship and the nouns,
Yeah,
the individual things are not that important compared to the relationships that things have with each other. So there are very relational languages. And
right.
those languages have very different cultural practices. You know, and a lot of indigenous North American tribes use the phrase "all my relations," and they're
Yeah,
talk about all my relatives are the rocks, the sky, the deer. Everything is a relation. It doesn't matter whether it's quote living or unliving. So,
yeah,
so those different frameworks create different, like, there's arguments about Sapir-Whorf because this we're talking about here is Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. How valid is it? How much does language change your reality? But it's not about reality change, it's about priority change. What are your cultural priorities, right? There's a reason you might have, you know, many words for sea ice and snow because you live among sea ice and snow, and knowing those subtle differences could be a life or death change. So, like, that knowledge, but then doesn't become very useful if you drop that person in a desert, right? So it's like, what are your priorities? Well, if you dropped into a desert climate after living in an ice climate, you're going to have to change priorities, and thus you're going to have to adapt new linguistic practices. So
yeah,
those are kinds of things to be thinking about. We have gone kind of over time. I mean, I don't mind chatting anthropology all night long. Um,
yeah.
is there anything that you want people to kind of take away from your field experiences, from your various research experiences, that they should be thinking about when they're building fictional worlds?
Yeah, I think, I mean, honestly, I think it's just going down to kind of core principles of anthropology, right? So, cultural relativism, this idea that all cultures are valid uh, when viewed on their own terms, right? And so, no culture is any more or less bizarre, beautiful, triumphant, messed up, than any other when you view it, at least when you try to view it on its own terms, right? Things that make complete sense to us and seem completely normal and matter of fact, common sense, blah blah blah, can be completely alien and offensive and ridiculous to another culture and vice versa. So I think just remembering, like, don't take for granted what is normal, right? Realize that what is normal is always a social construct, and then there is always going to be diversity of opinion and uh, yeah, just different approaches to all this stuff. Um, try to avoid ethnocentrism. Try to avoid that idea that, like, my culture or the culture that I am most familiar with or that I think is best like is better than others inherently. Nobody's inherently better or worse than anybody else. And all of this is not the same as ethical or moral relativism. This idea that like, oh, there's no universal right or wrong. The way I love to talk about it with my students is like, no, every culture agrees that murder is wrong. Not every culture agrees on what is murder. Our own culture doesn't agree on what is murder. We literally have degrees of murder, and we have manslaughter and degrees of manslaughter.
And
So
we have
like,
debates. We have debates
and we have
over
debates on
who do we sacrifice and all kinds of things.
Yeah, exactly. Whose life is worth more or less than others? Who do we deem to be acceptable losses or tragedies? You know, like this is the heart of necropolitics. The exercise of that necro power, right, is questions of whose life matters more or less than others, whose deaths matter more or less than others, and why. And so, yeah, I think those are big things. And honestly, like a big takeaway is learn to love research, like learn to love going down Wikipedia rabbit holes. And like the more points of reference that you have and like the more context you have to kind of build your world, yeah, the more that you can like root your fictional narratives in real life ones, the stronger that they become. Because yeah, if you want to impart that sense of authenticity, go to authentic stories. You know, again, truth is always going to be stranger than fiction, and so you know, any scenario that you can imagine, there is as fantastic or maybe more unimaginably fantastic ones that have actually happened in real life. You know, and so yeah, just have fun with casting a broad net, a wide net, to like and seeing the connections between a bunch of different kind of areas, finding those areas of hyper focus and rabbit hole deep dives and stuff, and you know, don't get caught in the trap of like every aspect of my world building, every aspect of this needs to be fully cohesive and coherent. If you are writing about human beings or other intelligent beings, probably we are beings of contradictions. We're never 100% consistent on anything, and so it doesn't always have to make complete, like every question doesn't have to be answered, every detail doesn't have to be attended to, and in fact, like those areas of ambiguity can be the most enticing, right? I love in the King Killer Chronicles, the Name of the Wind series there, Patrick Rothfuss does fabulous world building. And one of the big things is that like he alludes to these commonly understood histories that everybody knows. So why would you go into detail about them? And of course, as the reader, I'm like, I want you to go into detail, but like we don't go into a deep dive on Ben Franklin every time we mention Ben Franklin, right? Because like he's just known. We don't go into a deep dive on the American Revolution every time that we talk about it, because like we don't need to give that exposition to people who already know exactly, you know, or have an idea, you know, of what we're talking about. So like, yeah, leaving those like hints of like, oh yeah, everybody knows about the, you know, the Great Mars Wars, you know, and we all know what happened, you know, with that thing or whatever, you know, like that kind of like leaving those open, ambiguous things, but kind of showing that there is a common understanding. Like that's going to be more satisfying to me than like, you know, no shade to J.R.R. Tolkien, obviously, but like Buddy loved to go into like the deep details of every single hill that the Fellowship passes on their way to this and the other. Like, don't get me wrong, like that can be awesome, right? And he was going for a very specific narrative style that, you know, gave those shout outs to the Eddas and to all this stuff. But like for a lot of people, that's difficult.
Well, it's also, what's the priority of your story? What are you trying to do with your story? And so if your priority is to give people an idea of different possibilities of organizing political and economic systems, then that's probably where a lot of your energy in the world building is going to be looking into. And how do they figure out those alternative arrangements and systems? I love Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy is a great example of like what would happen to you if you did just put the human species on a different planet that is far enough away that, like, you know, we're talking about like in the beginning of the series, like a couple of years for anyone to kind of get out there, and then later on towards the series, yeah, it's much quicker, a couple of months, but it's still, you know, like what would that do to the human psyche to completely uproot Earth landscape and put you in a completely different gravity, psychologically, culturally? Like, what does that do to thinking? And like that's his big question. And I mean, you want to talk about someone who's like Tolkien? He builds out just about every arena of science, and you get pages and pages and pages of stuff. And a lot of people can't stand to read them because it's so long. But I love all the detail.
That's the thing. Like I love, like that's the trap that I always fall into. Is like sit down to write a fictional story, and then I get caught up in just building the world, and like, oh, like what I want to do is write an encyclopedia of like the world in this world, when I should be writing about the characters, right? So, but yeah, that gets to the question, like, yeah, what do you want to do? And I think a general rule is probably like focus on relationships, right? I think that's where you get the emotional investment and hook, and it's from there and how those relationships interact with the world that you build that like you really get that that emotional investment and that connection and that compelling narrative, you know. So yeah, like again, like I feel like it's not like super profound insights, but you know, like develop your characters, I think, more than anything else, because like the world that you build in which they're interacting, like what's going to be interesting is how those characters that you've developed meet that world, right, and move through it. So yeah.
Do you have any particular books or resources on border zones or death and dying that you think people should consider reading if they're trying to do research in those areas?
Oh man, yeah. There's so many. It's kind of a hard one to like without like, you know, kind of a more specific like, oh, I'm looking for this in relationship to borders, but
and we certainly mentioned some earlier too. I'll try to get all those in the. I'll try to update the description after the episode to include all the various mentions.
Yeah, you know, like I do want to shout out my committee co-chair, Dr. Carlos Velez Ibanez. He's a foundational transborder studies scholar. You know, one of the first Chicano or Mexican American anthropologists and border studies guys, and just, you know, he collected a lot of firsts that were important, but he also does just really, I mean, really exemplary work on what it means to be a border scholar and work in these zones. So like his book Reflections of a Transborder Anthropologist, I hope I'm getting that title right, but he does kind of a retrospective of his work on borders, and I think it's very valuable for asking these exact questions of like, what does culture look like? What are the implications of studying and working in these areas? Understanding what borders are, death and dying stuff. If you're looking for like border necropolitics stuff, on the heavier academic side is Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics. He's the guy who coined the term, first with an article and then with a book. More accessible, especially in terms of like migrant death stuff, is Jason De Leon's Land of Open Graves, Gabriela Soto's books. There's I'm really kind of drawing a blank on like what to recommend in terms of death, because like there is just like
there's so much.
There's so much, and it varies so much depending on like what questions you're asking and that kind of stuff. But
yeah, she's kind of a more popular writer actually, who wrote like she goes across different cultures. What is the name of that? It's like subtitles like The Journey to Look for the Good Death or something like that. And
oh yeah, you know, Caitlin Doughty's
books, yeah.
Yeah, you know what? Ask a Mortician. You know, so Caitlin Dowdy of Ask a Mortician fame has a number of great books like From Here to Eternity.
That's the one I was thinking of, From Here to Eternity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think she's written a couple others, but no, honestly, like she is a wonderful place to start for just about anybody who's interested in questions of death and dying. She does a fabulous job of making very accessible content. Her videos are great, so check those out on YouTube. Um, yeah, I'm sure that like after we log off and everything, like, oh, here's the the long list of things that I could have said, but
Yep.
I
If
mean,
you
you can
get
check out
if you send me
if
a
you, if
list,
you
I'll put it in in the comments below later. So
yeah. So
um,
you can always check out like I have a number of articles that are like in the process of publication or review or or authorship and stuff. So I don't really have too much published at the moment. Um, if you have access to ProQuest, I my master's thesis is on the African roots of Mexican curanderismo, but that goes into like West African traditional medicine, indigenous stuff, the history of healing traditions, like in this colonial context. So that can provide some interesting or useful stuff potentially. And that bibliography has all kinds of stuff from hardcore academic theory to like websites on voodoo and like card reading and stuff like that. And my PhD dissertation, right, it's a bit of a beast. I had to edit it down to like 300 something pages from a 500-page monstrosity that I wrote in a fever pitch in a week ish. Don't recommend. Don't do grad school that way, kids. It's a bad idea. but that bibliography has a huge amount. I mean, huge amount of thanatological stuff, border studies stuff, magic, witchcraft, and healing stuff, things on embodied healing, embodied suffering, embodied trauma. And I'm happy to provide PDF copies of that if you don't have access to ProQuest. I don't, believe in like locking scholarship behind paywalls. So feel free to reach out to me through socials at Chui Kukui on Instagram, Jesús Cuauhtémoc Villa on Facebook.
yeah, and I
Among
tagged him.
threads.
I tagged him in the post for this episode. So if you find me on Instagram, you'll see look at the post for this episode, and he's tagged on it, so you can ask him direct questions that way. But thank you so much for coming on. You gave us a lot of your time, and we very much really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks so much. I have our next episode. I'm still pinning down. We'll be having a expert on monsters. I figured I would try to find us one for spooky season because spooky season's coming. But she's an Australian anthropologist, and we're just trying to pin down the exact date in September she's coming on. As soon as I have that, you'll see it up in my live feed. And as always, you can check out my book, Build Better Worlds: An Introduction to Anthropology for Game Designers, Fiction Writers, and Filmmakers. And that was co-written with Kira Wellstrom, who is a forensic anthropologist as well. And of course, check out my website for all kinds of free recordings and this show. So thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for being here, everybody. Cheers.